married at 14, pregnant 14 times, dead at 36. Anne of Brittany, the only woman ever crowned twice as Queen of France, lived a life draped in jewels yet chained by duty. Was her death merely the hand of illness, or the slow assassination of a system that consumed women to preserve crowns? In this story, we unearth the silent tragedy of Anne of Brittany, the last Duchess of a land swallowed whole by the French throne. The story begins in Nantes, in the heart of Brittany. Imagine the city in the late 15th century. Narrow cobbled streets echoing with the sound of wooden wheels, the salty air drifting in from the Atlantic, the high stone walls of the ducal palace standing as the last defense of a proud but fragile independence. Inside those walls, in 1477, a daughter was born to Duke Francis II and Margaret of Foix. They named her Anne. To her parents, she was a child of promise. But to history, she would become something else entirely, a pawn in a game much larger than herself. From the very beginning, Anne's life was mapped not in years, but in treaties. While other children learned songs and games, she was learning the weight of expectation. Every lullaby sung in her chamber carried an undertone of politics. Every prayer whispered over her cradle was shadowed by fear. Fear that Brittany, that small but wealthy duchy, might lose its independence under the crushing shadow of France. For centuries, Brittany had danced on the edge of freedom, keeping kings at bay with clever diplomacy and strategic marriages. And now, the infant Anne was the last hope of that delicate balance. Her father, Duke Francis, was aging, worn down by battles and negotiations. He knew that when he died, Brittany would be vulnerable. With no surviving sons, Anne's hand in marriage became not a matter of love or choice, but the very cornerstone of the duchy's survival. At 11 years old, Anne was already promised, already spoken for. She would not choose her husband. He would be chosen for her. She would not choose her fate. It had been written long before she could even read. And here lies the first fracture in her story. Childhood should be a season of innocence. Yet Anne's was marked by dread. In her lessons, she was not taught simply to embroider or to sing. She was taught languages, courtly manners, the art of diplomacy. The message was clear. She was not being raised as a daughter. She was being prepared as a bargaining chip. Her smile, her lineage, her dowry, all would one day be handed over, not to honor her, but to preserve a political line. Picture a girl standing at the window of the ducal palace, her eyes scanning the horizon, where the French banners sometimes appeared in the distance. The sound of galloping horses would make her heart skip. Every rumor of battle or treaty whispered in the halls was a reminder. Her fate was not hers. She belonged not to herself, not even to her father, but to the destiny of Brittany. The French crown loomed ever closer. King Charles VIII, with his armies and his ambitions, saw Brittany not as a partner, but as a prize. And in Anne, he saw the key. Marriage to her would mean the end of Brittany's independence. It would mean her homeland swallowed into the French kingdom. And yet, for Anne, this looming reality remained half-hidden, disguised in the language of duty. At 11, she was old enough to understand that she would marry for her country. But was she old enough to realize that in doing so, she would lose her country altogether? History rarely pauses to ask what a child feels. But imagine it. The pressure of her father's weakening rule pressing down on her small shoulders. The knowledge that entire armies marched and clashed because of the marriage negotiations swirling around her. At night, perhaps she whispered prayers into the darkness. Prayers not for toys or dresses, but for peace, for a chance to remain at home. But peace would not come. Francis II fell gravely ill. With every faltering step, every pained breath, the fate of Brittany tightened around Anne's neck. The dukedom's allies dwindled. France pressed harder, and, as if guided by some cruel hand, the girl's childhood slipped away. There is an image we must hold here, a child in a grand hall, dwarfed by the tapestries of her ancestors, while ambassadors argue over her future. The air thick with incense, the sound of quills scratching treaties, the weight of centuries pressing into one girl's life. The hall might as well have been a courtroom, and Anne, though innocent, was the prisoner awaiting sentence. If she had been a boy, her fate might have been different. As a son, she could have led armies, defended the duchy with sword in hand, or at least claimed the right to rule in her own name. But as a daughter, her body was the battlefield. Her womb would be the place where dynasties collided. Her hand in marriage was the ransom for her people's survival. And so the first chapter of Anne's tragedy is not one of death, but of denial. The denial of a childhood. The denial of choice. A duchess before she could understand the word. A prize before she could speak for herself. A living treaty signed in flesh and blood. As we leave this part of her story, the girl of Nantes stands at a threshold. Ahead lies not the freedom of youth, but the iron gate of duty. Behind her, the laughter of childhood fades. Before her, the shadow of France stretches long and unyielding. Anne of Brittany was born to be married off, and in that simple truth, her tragedy had already begun. The year was 1491. The banners of France, heavy with the golden lilies of the crown, had marched into Brittany. The clash that her father Francis had dreaded for years was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was a reality grinding its boots into the soil of her homeland. Castles fell. Treaties broke. And in the midst of this storm, a 14-year-old girl was placed before the altar, her life sealed not by love, but by conquest. Anne of Brittany became the bride of King Charles VIII of France. Pause here and imagine her. A girl whose childhood had barely ended, dressed in silk so heavy it felt more like armor than finery, standing beneath vaulted ceilings where priests spoke blessings she could hardly hear. The church echoed not with joy, but with the silence of resignation. To the courtiers, it was a triumph of politics. To Anne, it was the erasure of her homeland, disguised as a wedding. The union was not a choice. It was the culmination of war. France had invaded Brittany precisely to ensure that Anne could not be married elsewhere, that no rival crown could claim her and keep the duchy independent. And so, in that ceremony, Brittany itself was wed to France. Every ring on her finger was another chain tightening around her people. Think of the irony. As the crown of a queen was placed on her head, the crown of a duchess was taken from her heart. For Anne, marriage was not freedom. It was captivity. The Palace of France became her golden prison, every chamber echoing with the memory of the independence she had just lost. She was both exalted and diminished. Exalted because she was now Queen of France, seated beside one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Diminished because she had no power of her own. Her role was not to rule, but to submit, not to command, but to produce heirs. In the eyes of the court, she was both a jewel to display and a womb to be guarded. There is a cruel symmetry in her story. At 14, she was given a throne, but she lost a homeland. She was crowned in glory, but stripped of agency. She was praised as the hope of France, but mourned as the death of Brittany. What others celebrated as victory, she must have felt as defeat. Her inner world is harder to see, for history rarely records the whispers of a queen's heart. But imagine the silence of her wedding chamber that first night. The dim glow of candles, the chill of stone walls pressing in. The girl who once gazed from the windows of Nantes now found herself far from home. Her voice muted, her choices erased. Did she cry? Did she remain still, already hardened by the knowledge that her tears would change nothing? The records are silent, but silence itself is telling. France rejoiced. The union meant stability, power, and a future unchallenged by rival dukes. But beneath the surface of celebration lay the truth. This was not a marriage between equals. It was the absorption of one land into another, the swallowing of Brittany into France. And Anne herself was the vessel of that absorption, the human sacrifice made respectable by the rituals of church and court. The people of Brittany grieved quietly. They knew that their duchess, once the guardian of their independence, was now the wife of the king who had conquered them. Yet even in grief, some held on to hope. Perhaps Anne, as queen, could still protect them. Perhaps her influence could soften the dominance of France. But hope has always been a fragile thing when weighed against politics. In those first years as queen, Anne walked the marble halls of French palaces with her head held high. But her heart remained anchored in the stone walls of Brittany. She was a symbol now, not only of unity, as France proclaimed, but of loss, as Brittany remembered. Every step she took in French silks was a step away from the fields, churches, and people of her homeland. This is the paradox of her second chapter. Anne had gained the world of France, but lost the world of Brittany. She was not simply a bride. She was a boundary line redrawn. And though history paints her as the Queen of France, she never stopped being the Duchess of Brittany, if not in law, then in loyalty. Her marriage at 14 was not the end of her childhood. It was the execution of it. And as she stood beside Charles VIII, smiling as duty required, one truth lingered beneath every jewel and every robe. She was a prisoner dressed as a queen. The echo of wedding bells soon gave way to a different sound, the muffled cries of infants who would not live to grow. For Anne of Brittany, marriage meant not only the loss of her homeland, but the beginning of a cycle that would define and eventually destroy her life. She was expected to give France heirs, and she tried. Over and over again she tried. But fate, or perhaps the cruel arithmetic of medieval medicine, answered each attempt with tragedy. Anne became pregnant again and again. The court watched with breathless anticipation each time her body began to swell, whispering about the future of the dynasty. Every pregnancy was a national event, every swelling belly a promise that Brittany's loss might at least be redeemed with stability for France. But time after time, the promise broke. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who survived only days, sometimes hours. The cradle in the royal nursery became a revolving door of hope and despair. Picture the great halls of the palace, filled with tapestries and flickering torches. In the silence of those walls, a mother's weeping became another kind of anthem, private, hidden, yet unrelenting. Anne, once a duchess who embodied the spirit of a nation, was reduced to a grieving mother, clutching empty blankets. The sound of lullabies in her chambers often turned into the sound of wailing, muffled so that courtiers might not hear. But grief, no matter how silenced, has a way of seeping through stone. The court of France called it the greatest sorrow of the crown. For the king, it was a dynastic crisis. For the realm, it was a danger to stability. But for Anne, it was something more intimate, more devastating. The breaking of her heart in the most human way possible. She did not only lose children, she lost pieces of herself with each tiny grave dug into the soil of Saint-Denis. Imagine the way grief compounds. The first loss brings shock. The second brings fear. The third brings resignation. After a while, death ceases to be an exception and becomes the expectation. For Anne, pregnancy became not a season of hope, but a slow countdown towards sorrow. She must have looked at each cradle with suspicion, at each infant's face with dread. Not because she did not love them, but because she knew love would soon be replaced by loss. This is the moment when the grandeur of monarchy shatters. Queens are crowned with jewels, praised in ceremonies, painted in splendor. But behind closed doors, Anne was no different from any mother burying her children. Only, unlike ordinary women, her grief was public property. Each death was recorded, each failure debated, each miscarriage another line in the chronicles of France. Her most private pain was paraded as national tragedy. Think of the psychological torment of such a role. To fail as a mother was, in the eyes of the crown, to fail as a queen. Her worth was measured in infants that survived. And so, though she was draped in silks and gold, Anne was haunted by whispers. Whispers of failure, of weakness, of divine punishment. The palace itself seemed to conspire against her, its echoing chambers filled with ghosts of children who never grew old enough to laugh or speak. In this, Anne became not simply a political prisoner, but a prisoner of her own body. Every attempt at motherhood was a battle she fought without armor, without weapons, and without victory. Her strength was not in conquering lands, but in enduring the unendurable. And endure she did, though the endurance left scars far deeper than any blade could carve. There is an image that lingers from this part of her life. Anne sitting in a nursery that feels more like a mausoleum, surrounded by cradles that have held more death than life. The fire burns low. The walls are heavy with shadows, and she cradles an absence as if it were flesh. The silence is deafening. The tragedy of Anne's empty cradles is not only her personal grief, it is the larger truth it reveals. Dynasties were built on the bodies of women, yet those bodies broke again and again under the unbearable pressure of expectation. Anne's sorrow was not unique. It was the sorrow of countless royal women whose names we may never know, whose children died before they were written into history. But Anne, because she was queen, bore her sorrow in full view. And though the chronicles may frame it as dynastic misfortune, we must not forget the human reality. A woman, young and alone, trapped in the endless rhythm of pregnancy, birth, and death. Her story in this chapter is not of war, not of politics, not of treaties. It is of lullabies that ended in silence, of cradles that became coffins, of a mother who became a symbol of grief. Anne of Brittany was not just the Queen of France. She was a mother who buried her children again and again, until grief itself became her shadow. The cycle of loss seemed unending. And then, as if fate wanted to strike in yet another direction, tragedy shifted from the nursery to the throne itself. In 1498, Charles VIII, the boy king she had married at 14, died suddenly. He had been so young, so full of plans for conquests in Italy, yet in a single night his ambitions collapsed when he struck his head on a low doorway at Amboise. Just like that, France was left without an heir, and Anne, not yet 22, was a widow. For the first time since her girlhood, Anne reclaimed a fragment of freedom. As the widow of the French king, she returned to Brittany, her duchy still legally hers, her title once again restored. Imagine the sense of breath that must have filled her chest as she crossed back into the land of her birth. She was greeted not as a defeated queen, but as the Duchess who might yet save Brittany's independence. For a brief moment, it seemed as if history had bent back in her favor, as though the sacrifices of her adolescence could be undone. But politics does not give freedom so easily. The crown of France had lost a king, but it still hungered for Brittany. And less than a year later, Anne's supposed freedom dissolved. She was compelled into yet another marriage, this time with Louis XII, Charles's cousin and successor. It was a marriage of convenience, of dynastic necessity, not of choice. Anne protested, but resistance had little meaning. The ink of treaties, the weight of armies, the relentless machinery of monarchy, all pressed her toward the altar once again. And so, at 22, she became Queen of France for the second time. The only woman in history to hold that title twice. On the surface, it was triumph. Chroniclers wrote of her as a woman of exceptional dignity, blessed to be twice crowned, a jewel of continuity for the kingdom. But underneath, it was bondage disguised as glory. Anne herself understood that this second coronation was not an honor, but a sentence. For the second time, her identity as Duchess was swallowed by her role as Queen. For the second time, her body became the battleground on which dynasties waged their wars. This paradox deserves to be seen in all its bitterness. To be twice a queen should have been the mark of extraordinary fortune, of rare authority. Instead, it was proof of how little choice she had. Her life was not a story of triumph, but of repetition, of captivity renewed under a different name. She wore the same crown, sat in the same palaces, heard the same whispers of expectation. But now, the weight was doubled, for she knew precisely what this role demanded of her. Endless pregnancies, endless grief. Picture the coronation ceremony. The cathedral filled with incense, choirs singing hymns of glory, nobles bowing in reverence, Anne in her finery, once again kneeling before the altar. But in her eyes, if we look closely, not triumph, but resignation. The glow of the candles could not mask the shadows beneath her crown. This was no ascent to power. It was a return to prison. And yet, Anne was not without resilience. She maneuvered in court politics where she could, clung to her Breton identity, and sought to preserve what fragments of autonomy remained. She had coins minted with her image as Duchess of Brittany, a subtle reminder that she had never relinquished her first title, even while forced to bear the second. In doing so, she became a figure suspended between two worlds, Queen to France, Duchess to Brittany, belonging fully to neither. This duality is haunting. It is as though she lived two lives in one body, one public, gilded and exalted, the other private, broken and grieving. To France, she was a triumph of diplomacy, the glue binding Brittany forever into the crown. To Brittany, she was a captive heroine, forced to surrender but still carrying their heart. To herself, she was something harder to define, a woman who had been married off twice, crowned twice, and silenced twice. The tragedy of this chapter is not only in the marriages themselves, but in the illusion they created. Twice crowned, she appeared to be the most powerful woman in Europe. But in reality, she was powerless. Her life was decided by others, her body claimed by the state, her voice drowned by ceremony. She was the living embodiment of contradiction, draped in glory, but denied freedom, exalted in title, but erased in choice. Anne of Brittany remains the only woman to have been twice Queen of France. History records this as a curiosity, a rare fact. But beneath the surface, it is a scar. for what history calls unique, Anne might have called unbearable. By the time Anne of Brittany reached her 30s, her life had become a relentless rhythm of pregnancy, mourning, and physical collapse. 14 times she carried life within her. 14 times she endured the agony of childbirth. Yet most of those lives ended in silence, and each new attempt left her body weaker, more ravaged than before. To the court, these pregnancies were a matter of dynastic survival. To Anne, they were ordeals. Ordeals that demanded not just her strength, but her very being. Imagine the queen in her chamber, attendants hovering with basins of water and bundles of linen, physicians murmuring incantations of reassurance that neither faith nor medicine could guarantee. Each time she faced the terror of death. For childbirth in her age was as perilous as the battlefield. Each time she emerged more diminished, her spirit chipped away by the repetition of grief. Her body, once celebrated as a vessel of unity between Brittany and France, became a battlefield scarred by pain. She developed kidney stones, a condition as agonizing as it was relentless. In a time without modern surgery, without anesthesia, she bore spasms of pain that left her doubled over, clutching her abdomen, her face pale as marble. And yet the demands did not cease. She was still expected to conceive again, to endure again, to sacrifice again. The image is cruelly ironic. A queen seated upon gilded thrones, yet unable to walk across a chamber without wincing. A woman dressed in silks and jewels, yet whose nights were spent writhing with pain in a darkened bed. The very body that symbolized power in public was, in private, a sight of torment. The courtiers whispered of her strength, of her dignity. But behind their words was another truth. She was being consumed, slowly, by the machinery of monarchy. She was not dying of one wound, one poison, one dagger. She was dying by accumulation. Each childbirth drained her further. Each kidney stone left her weaker. Each loss carved her soul hollow. And here we must pause and ask, what does power mean when it comes at the cost of the body? Anne of Brittany was the highest woman in France, yet she was powerless over her own flesh. She could not refuse the bed, could not refuse the child, could not refuse the pain. Her crown was an ornament, her body the true currency of her reign. There is a haunting scene that history cannot record, but which imagination can reach. Anne sitting in the middle of her chamber, sunlight filtering through colored glass, tapestries glowing with stories of knights and saints. Around her, attendants whisper. In her hands, she holds not a scepter, not a rosary, but her stomach doubled over in pain. Her eyes are distant, hollow, as though already resigned to the fate that the world demanded of her. This was the summit of her tragedy. Not war, not assassination, not betrayal, but exhaustion. To be worn away, piece by piece, until life itself became unbearable. And yet, she endured. She endured because she had no choice, because queens were not allowed to collapse, because her suffering was never considered hers alone, but always the property of France. The contradiction deepens here. Anne was both indispensable and disposable. Indispensable because her body carried the future of the dynasty. Disposable because once her body broke, there would always be another queen, another woman, another womb to take her place. That is the cruelty of dynastic politics. Women celebrated when they give life, forgotten when life drains from them. Her presence at court became a paradox. She was visible, honored, praised as a mother of the nation. Yet she was also fading, hollowing out, becoming a shadow within her own body. Each pregnancy left scars invisible to the eye but indelible in her soul. Each wave of pain from her illness reminded her that her body was no longer hers. The court saw a queen. History records a duchess twice crowned. But the truth of Anne at this moment is more intimate, more devastating. A woman trapped in a body that had been transformed into a cage. Her strength was not the power of armies or thrones. It was the endurance of pain, repeated until endurance itself became indistinguishable from despair. And so, by the middle of her life, Anne of Brittany had become the living embodiment of contradiction. Outwardly powerful, inwardly powerless. Outwardly queenly, inwardly broken. Outwardly the pride of France, inwardly the prisoner of a body that was being consumed day by day by the weight of expectation. This was not simply her decline, it was her undoing. The winter of 1514 settled heavy over the chateau of Blois. The Loire River outside ran dark and swollen, its waters carrying the whispers of a kingdom that sensed an ending was near. Inside those walls, behind velvet curtains and guarded doors, Anne of Brittany, Duchess, twice queen, mother, prisoner, lay dying. She was 36 years old. The cause was not sudden, not violent, not the kind of death that history usually finds dramatic enough to remember. It was slow, almost mundane. The grinding down of a body that had carried too much, endured too much, bled too much. Her kidneys, already torn apart by stones, no longer functioned. Her frame was frail from the repeated toll of 14 pregnancies. She had been living in pain for years, and now the pain had finally claimed her entirely. The court gathered in hushed tones. Physicians came and went with their potions of herbs and prayers. But medicine in the early 16th century was as powerless as Anne herself had been in the face of her fate. Attendants lit candles, their flames wavering in the draught of stone halls, a fragile echo of the life that flickered within their queen. And yet, Blois was not silent. Outside her chamber, courtiers moved like shadows, whispering not only of her health, but of succession, of politics, of what her death would mean for the fragile balance between Brittany and France. Even in her last hours, Anne was not only a woman dying. She was still a political object, her body tied to treaties, her death already reshaping the map of Europe. Inside, though, there was only stillness and Anne. Imagine her lying in a great carved bed, the canopy above her embroidered with scenes of saints and martyrs, the irony of their suffering mirrored in her own. Her breathing shallow, her eyes darkened by exhaustion, her body collapsing under the weight of years of expectation. Did she think of Brittany in those final hours? Did her mind return to the stone streets of Nantes, to the salty air of the coast, to the home she had lost before she was old enough to defend it? On January 9th, 1514, Anne of Brittany died. No sword pierced her, no poison cup ended her days, no conspirator's daggers silenced her life. Instead, she was undone by something quieter, more merciless: the slow erosion of the human body under relentless duty. France mourned her publicly. The court draped itself in black, and ceremonies were held to honor her as twice Queen of France. Yet beneath the solemn rituals, there lingered another kind of grief. The grief of Brittany, her homeland, which saw in her death the final extinguishing of hope for independence. For them, Anne had been more than a queen. She had been the last duchess, the final defense of a people swallowed by a crown too large to resist. Here lies the cruelest paradox of her end. In France, she was mourned as a queen whose body had failed to secure heirs. In Brittany, She was mourned as a heroine whose body had been consumed by France. In both, she was mourned as something other than herself. The woman Anne, the child who once looked out from the windows of Nantes, the girl forced into marriage at 14, the mother who buried her children, was lost beneath the layers of symbolism. Her death at Blois was not spectacular, not cinematic in the way history prefers to tell stories. But perhaps that is why it haunts us more deeply. It was quiet. It was ordinary. It was the kind of death countless women suffered in her age. The death of a body asked to do too much, too often, until it could do no more. And that ordinariness is what makes it tragic. Anne of Brittany, Duchess and Queen, did not fall in battle or collapse in betrayal. She died in a bed, in pain, at 36. The silence of Blois on that winter morning was not just the end of a life. It was the end of a duchy's independence, the end of a woman's endurance, the end of a story that had been written not by her, but for her. Her collapse was not sudden. It was the slow, inevitable collapse of a woman consumed by duty, until the last breath left her lips and the candles in her chamber burned for her, not with her. When Anne's body was prepared for burial, a final act of defiance was revealed, a request she had carried with her long before death came. She had ordered that her heart be removed from her body and returned to Nantes, the city of her birth, the city of her duchy. Her body would lie among kings and queens in the royal necropolis of Saint-Denis, as French tradition demanded. But her heart, that most human, most symbolic of organs, would rest in Brittany. It is here that Anne's story breaks apart into two images: the queen and the duchess, the conqueror's bride and the homeland's daughter, the body draped in the regalia of France, entombed in cold marble among strangers, and the heart, carried home in a gilded reliquary, beating no longer but still alive in the memory of her people. Imagine the procession through the streets of Nantes. Citizens lined the cobblestones, holding candles against the chill of winter, heads bowed as the reliquary passed. It was not just a funeral, it was an act of reclamation. The people could not save Anne in life, but they could honor her in death. They could cradle her heart as if to say, "You were ours, and in some way, you still are." The reliquary itself was a masterpiece, a golden vessel engraved with symbols of Brittany, its shape resembling a small casket, its weight heavy not just with metal, but with meaning. To see it lowered into the Cathedral of Nantes was to witness a declaration. Anne's body may belong to France, but her soul belonged to Brittany. This act resonates far beyond the 16th century. In splitting her remains, Anne told a truth that no coronation or treaty could erase. She had lived divided, and she would remain divided, even in death. France had taken her as a queen, but Brittany would keep her as a daughter. The symbolism is profound. Her body, the tool of dynastic politics, lay in Saint-Denis, where the dead kings of France surrounded her, silent witnesses to the cost of monarchy. But her heart, the vessel of her love, her identity, her loyalty, lay closer to the soil of her homeland. It is as if she whispered from the grave, "Power may claim my flesh, but love claims my heart." For the Bretons, this was more than sentiment. It was defiance. Anne's reliquary became a shrine, a symbol of their independence even after the duchy was annexed. To kneel before it was to mourn not only a woman, but a nation. To light a candle beside it was to remember that Brittany had once been free, that its last duchess had never abandoned them. And for us, centuries later, the image endures. A queen divided even in death. a woman forced to split her existence between two worlds, now split even in burial. Few deaths speak so clearly of a life lived in fragments, of a fate that belonged to everyone but herself. Her heart in Nantes was not just a relic, it was a rebellion, quiet but eternal. 500 years have passed. And yet the life of Anne of Brittany still forces us to confront questions that echo into our present. What does it mean to be powerful? What does it mean to be free? Anne wore 2 crowns, lived in castles gilded with gold, commanded the outward respect of nations. Yet she had little control over her own body, her own choices, even her own death. From the perspective of today, Anne's life reads less like a royal triumph and more like a cautionary tale. We can see now what was harder to see then, that her body was treated as a resource, her womb as a battlefield, her marriages as contracts of conquest. She was not loved as Anne. She was consumed as the Duchess of Brittany, as the Queen of France, as the vessel through which 2 nations were bound together. Modern feminism gives us a lens sharp enough to pierce through the pageantry. What happened to Anne was not unique. It was systemic. Royal women across Europe were traded like chess pieces, their lives reduced to dynastic functions. Anne simply bore it more visibly than most, and in her suffering we glimpse the suffering of countless women whose names never made it into chronicles. Ask yourself, if Anne had been born a son, would her life have unraveled in this way? A son could have ruled Brittany outright, led armies, chosen his alliances, and perhaps even resisted France. But Anne, as a daughter, was denied that path. Her throne was replaced by a cradle, her sword by a crown, her independence by marriage contracts she could not refuse. Her tragedy was not just personal, it was structural. The symbolism of her 2 queenships feels almost cruel under this lens. Historians call it extraordinary, the only woman crowned twice as Queen of France. But extraordinary in what sense? Extraordinary in glory? Or extraordinary in exploitation? To us, it looks less like honor and more like double imprisonment. Twice crowned, twice consumed, twice denied her own will. And then there is her body, broken by 14 pregnancies, carved hollow by pain. How often do we remember that queens, beneath the silks and jewels, were women of flesh and blood? How often do we pause to think that Anne's power, celebrated by poets and chroniclers, came at the cost of her own health, her own life? We exalt the grandeur of dynasties, but we forget the women who died to sustain them. The modern world allows us to reinterpret her reliquary, the heart in Nantes. In her time, it was an act of devotion to Brittany, a symbol of loyalty. But now, it can also be seen as an act of resistance. In a world that demanded she belong to France, she insisted on belonging, at least in part, to herself. In that gilded casket lay not only her heart, but her defiance. A reminder that even when everything else is taken, some fragments of self can still be claimed. Her story, viewed through our eyes, raises questions larger than her own life. How many women throughout history have been written out, remembered only for the titles they carried, the heirs they failed or succeeded to produce, rather than the struggles they endured? How many Anne of Brittany's lie hidden beneath the surface of chronicles, unnamed but no less real? Anne's tragedy forces us to see monarchy itself differently. It is not just a tale of kings and battles and treaties. It is also a tale of bodies, bodies of women given away, torn apart, and forgotten. It is a reminder that the history of nations is inseparable from the history of women's suffering. And so, when we look back at Anne through the modern lens, we do not see only a queen. We see a woman denied choice, denied freedom, denied peace, yet still remembered centuries later as the last duchess who tried to belong to her people, even as she was forced to belong to a throne. Anne of Brittany is no longer just a historical figure. She is a symbol of endurance, of sacrifice, of a system that consumed women whole. Anne's story, though wrapped in crowns and castles, is not only about royalty, it is about humanity. When we strip away the gold and the marble, what remains is a woman who lived, who loved, who suffered, and who died far too young. Her life reminds us that history is not built solely by the victories of kings or the strategies of generals. It is also carved out of the silent endurance of women whose names are often footnotes, whose lives were sacrificed to keep dynasties alive. Think of the image that history has left us. Anne of Brittany, twice queen, surrounded by grandeur. Yet behind that image lies another truth. 14 pregnancies, most of them ending in death. Endless nights of pain from an illness untreated. A girl married at 14, a duchess stripped of her homeland, a woman who never once had the chance to decide her own fate. That is the Anne who lingers in the shadows of the chronicles, not just a figure of politics, but a figure of flesh and grief. Her story compels us to reflect on the quiet tragedies that rarely make it into textbooks. How many women shared Anne's fate in silence? How many mothers buried their children without ceremony? How many young brides lost their lives to childbirth, their bodies worn down by duty? Anne, because of her crown, was remembered. But for every Anne, there were thousands whose names were lost, whose stories were buried alongside them. This is the human message hidden in her life, that suffering is not erased by ceremony, that crowns cannot shield the heart from breaking, that power, when built on the backs of the powerless, is always accompanied by tragedy. It is tempting to see Anne only as a queen, but to do so is to repeat the mistake of her own time, to view her only through what she gave to France, not who she was. She was more than a vessel for alliances. She was a daughter who longed for her homeland, a mother who wept for her children, a woman who endured pain with dignity. In remembering her as a person, not merely a symbol, we restore to her the humanity that politics denied her. Her life is also a mirror, reflecting our own time. We may live in an age far removed from arranged royal marriages and dynastic wars, but the question remains: how often are women still defined by what they can give to others, rather than who they are? Anne's tragedy is a reminder to ask and to resist. In the end, her story is not only about loss, it is also about remembrance. Her heart, buried in Nantes, still beats as a symbol, a silent protest, a declaration that she was more than a queen of France. She was Anne of Brittany, and Brittany never let her go. Through her, we learn that history's true power lies not in crowns, but in compassion, not in victories, but in voices, not in monuments, but in memory. Her life tells us that the forgotten deserve to be remembered, that the silenced deserve to be heard. And so, the message of Anne of Brittany is simple, but profound. History belongs not only to those who ruled, but to those who endured. In the dim light of Saint-Denis, her tomb still lies among kings. Cold stone, carved effigies, the silence of eternity. And yet, her story cannot be contained within those walls. For her heart, in its small reliquary of gold, beats still in Nantes. A woman who lived divided, buried divided, remembered divided. Her very death became the perfect symbol of her life, shared between two worlds, claimed by both, fully belonging to neither. And here, I must pause, not to retell history, but to step back as a narrator and ask, what does it mean to remember Anne today? To me, her tragedy is not just about a queen who died young, but about a system that slowly erased her humanity. She was not assassinated by poison or dagger. She was undone by expectation, by a political machine that demanded too much and gave too little, by a monarchy that saw her not as Anne, but as function, as body, as vessel. This is the part of her story that lingers for me, that her greatest act of resistance was not in life, but in death. To separate her heart from her body was to whisper across centuries, I was more than what you made of me. I belonged to my people, to myself. That act, quiet, tender, symbolic, still resounds more powerfully than any crown she ever wore. And maybe that is why Anne of Brittany haunts me, because her life forces us to confront a question we often avoid. How many lives, even today, are consumed by systems larger than themselves? How many people vanish in silence, their worth measured only by what they gave away, not by who they were? History, when told honestly, is not only about kings who conquered. It is also about women who endured and paid the price. Her story is not over. It continues every time we speak her name, every time we remember that beneath the crown was a woman who wept, who longed, who resisted in the only way she could. If you, like me, believe that these forgotten voices matter, that the hidden tragedies of the past deserve to be heard, then join us. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled, where we uncover the silenced stories, the buried sorrows, and the haunting echoes of history's most human moments. Because history is not just about power, it is about people. And people, even when forgotten, always matter.